The true nature of a partner often remains hidden until the money runs out, or until a fleet of armored SUVs descends upon the neighborhood. David believed he was simply cutting off dead weight when he dragged his 8-month pregnant wife, Coraline, out into the freezing November rain. He was convinced he had won, dismissing her as a nobody. But he was about to learn a brutal lesson. Some secrets are kept not out of shame, but for protection. When the black motorcade rolled up to his driveway, the shocked gasps of his neighbors were merely the prelude to his nightmare. The sound of a suitcase tumbling down the stairs was loud enough to rattle the framed wedding photos in the hallway photos that now seemed like they belonged to a different lifetime. Coraline clutched her swollen belly with one hand and gripped the banister with the other, her knuckles white. At 8 months pregnant, her center of gravity was off, and the sheer violence of her husband, David, throwing her belongings around, made the floor feel like it was tilting beneath her feet. "David, please, just listen to me." Coraline's voice cracked, desperate and thin. "It's freezing outside. Where am I supposed to go?" David stood at the bottom of the stairs, his face twisted into a sneer that made him look like a stranger. This wasn't the man she had met 3 years ago at a coffee shop in downtown Columbus. That man had been gentle, soft-spoken, a struggling architect who claimed all he wanted was a family. This man, standing in the foyer of the house she had helped renovate with her own savings, looked at her with pure, unadulterated contempt. "I don't care where you go, Coraline. You just can't stay here." David spat, kicking the suitcase toward the front door. "I'm done. We're done." Sitting on the floral armchair in the living room, sipping a cup of Earl Grey tea, as if she were watching a mild weather report, was Linda David's mother. She didn't look up. She just blew softly on the steam rising from her mug. "David, stop it," Coraline pleaded, taking a heavy step down. "This is about the paternity test, isn't it? I told you Linda is lying." "Why would I cheat on you? I haven't left this house in months, except for doctor appointments." Linda finally looked up, her eyes cold and hard like flint. "Don't you dare raise your voice at me, you leech. I saw the messages on your phone. I saw the bank transfers. You've been siphoning my son's money to some mystery account for months, probably saving up to run away with your real baby daddy." "That money was for the nursery," Coraline screamed, tears finally spilling over. "I moved it to a savings account so you wouldn't gamble it away at the casino again. Linda." The slap echoed through the house before Coraline even registered the pain. David had crossed the distance between them in a second. He stood over her, breathing heavily, his hand still raised. Coraline recoiled, her hand flying to her stinging cheek. The shock was worse than the pain. In 3 years, he had never laid a hand on her. "Don't you speak about my mother that way." David hissed, his voice trembling with a dangerous mix of rage and righteousness. "She's the only one looking out for me. She told me who you really are. You're a gold digger, Coraline, a fraud, and that bastard in your belly isn't mine." "It is yours," Coraline sobbed, backing away until she hit the wall. "Look at me. I gave up everything for you. I cut off my friends. I moved to this God-forsaken suburb. I have nothing left but you." "Exactly," Linda chimed in from the living room, setting her tea down with a delicate clink. "You have nothing. You brought nothing to this marriage but debt and lies. And now that David is finally up for that partnership at the firm, we don't need a scandal. We don't need a loose woman and another man's brat dragging him down." David grabbed Coraline by the arm. His grip was bruising. "Get out." "David, no. It's 30 degrees out there. I don't have a car. You sold it." "Walk," he said coldly. He dragged her towards the door. Coraline tried to dig her heels into the hardwood, but the weight of the pregnancy made her weak. She stumbled, her knees hitting the floor, but he didn't stop. He hauled her up and shoved her through the open front door. The November wind hit her like a physical blow. It was a wet, biting cold that cut right through her thin maternity sweater. She stumbled down the porch steps, barely catching herself on the railing before hitting the concrete walkway. Her suitcase, poorly zipped, came flying out behind her, landing in a puddle. Clothes spilled out into the mud. A tiny yellow knitted onesie she had made last week landed face down in the dirt. "David!" she screamed one last time, turning back to the house. The warmth of the hallway light spilled out, looking like heaven compared to the grey evening settling around her. David stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the light. Behind him, Linda appeared, a smug smile plastered on her face as she crossed her arms. "Don't come back," David said. "I'll send the divorce papers to whatever shelter you end up in." "You're making a mistake," Coraline cried, the freezing rain beginning to mix with her tears. "You don't know what you're doing. You don't know who—" Slam, the heavy oak door, the one she had sanded and stained herself last summer, slammed shut. The deadbolt clicked into place with a sound of finality that echoed in her bones. Coraline stood there for a moment, shivering violently, the rain instantly soaking her hair. She looked at the closed door, then down at the muddy onesie. She bent down, groaning with the effort, and picked it up. She shook off the mud, clutching it to her chest. Across the street, curtains twitched. Mrs. Higgins, the elderly widow who spent her days monitoring the neighborhood for HOA violations, was watching. Coraline saw the silhouette in the window. Usually she would have been embarrassed, but now all she felt was a deep, hollow terror. She had no phone. David had taken it to preserve evidence. She had no wallet. It was in her purse on the kitchen counter. She had no car. She was 8 months pregnant alone, and the temperature was dropping. As she dragged her wet suitcase toward the sidewalk, her legs trembling, she whispered to the darkness, "You promised you wouldn't make me do this, Dad. But I have no choice." The suburb of Oak Creek, Ohio, was the kind of place where people prided themselves on privacy, which was just a polite word for apathy. As Coraline dragged her broken suitcase down the sidewalk, the wheels clattering loudly against the pavement cracks, she could feel the eyes on her. It wasn't just Mrs. Higgins. As she passed the Miller residence, she saw the blue flicker of a television turn off and a face press against the glass. People were watching. They had heard the screaming. They had seen David shove a pregnant woman out into the rain. And nobody opened a door. Coraline's teeth began to chatter uncontrollably. Her hands were numb. The adrenaline from the argument was fading, replaced by the terrifying reality of hypothermia and the sharp, rhythmic cramping in her lower back. "Braxton Hicks," she prayed. "Please be Braxton Hicks. Not now. Not yet." She made it to the end of the block, sheltering under the awning of a closed bus stop. She sat on the metal bench, curling into herself to protect her stomach. Inside the house she had just left, the atmosphere was jubilant. David walked into the kitchen and grabbed a beer from the fridge. His hands were shaking slightly, but he told himself it was just the adrenaline of finally standing up for himself. "You did the right thing, honey," Linda cooed, walking in behind him and patting his back. "She was a cancer. You cut it out before it could kill you." David took a long swig. "I know. It felt extreme, Mom. It's freezing out there." "She's a survivor, David. Rats always find a hole to crawl into," Linda said, dismissively opening the pantry to look for snacks. "Besides, think about Jennifer. She's been asking about you. Now you're free to pursue a woman of your own status. Someone with class. Someone whose father is actually a partner at a law firm, not some mystery man Coraline refused to talk about. Yeah, David muttered. Why was she always so secretive about her family? She said they were dead to her. Probably because they're criminals, Linda scoffed. Or trailer trash she was ashamed of. Either way, you dodged a bullet. Now sit down. I made meatloaf. David sat, but his eyes kept drifting to the window. The rain was coming down harder now, turning into sleet. Back at the bus stop, Coraline was losing the battle against the cold. Her vision was getting blurry. She knew she needed help, but who could she call? She had no money for a payphone, even if she could find one. She closed her eyes, and her mind drifted back 3 years. She remembered the day she left home, the sprawling estate in the Hamptons, the security guards, the suffocating expectations of her father, Arthur Sterling. If you walk out that door with that Ormwood boy, Arthur had said, his voice low and dangerous, you leave everything behind. The name, the money, the protection. You want to be Coraline, plain and simple, fine. But don't come crawling back when the real world chews you up. I won't, she had told him. I'd rather be poor and loved than rich and controlled. She let out a bitter, choked laugh that turned into a cough. Poor and loved. What a joke. Suddenly lights swept across the wet pavement. Coraline squinted. A car was coming down the street. It wasn't a normal car. It was moving slowly, prowling. It was a black SUV, Chevy Suburban. Tinted windows so dark they looked like oil slicks. Then another one. Then a third. The convoy moved with a menacing grace, the engines purring with a low, heavy rumble that vibrated in Coraline's chest. They weren't police cars. There were no sirens. This was private money. Serious money. Coraline's heart stopped. She shrank back into the shadows of the bus stop, pulling her wet cardigan over her face. Did he find me? The cars didn't stop at the bus stop. They continued up the street, heading toward the cul-de-sac, toward David's house. Coraline watched, frozen, as the 3 massive vehicles pulled up to the curb, right in front of the house she had just been kicked out of. They blocked the driveway completely. The street, usually silent at 8 p.m., suddenly came alive. Porch lights flickered on. Mrs. Higgins actually stepped out onto her porch, forgetting her coat. The doors of the lead SUV opened. 2 men stepped out. They were giants wearing immaculate black suits despite the rain. They had earpieces. One of them held a large black umbrella. Then the rear door of the middle car opened. A man stepped out. He was older, perhaps in his 60s, but built like a fortress. He wore a charcoal wool trench coat that probably cost more than David's car. He had silver hair slicked back and a face carved from granite. He didn't look like a man who visited suburbs in Ohio. He looked like a man who owned continents. He stood on the sidewalk, ignoring the rain falling on his expensive shoulders, and looked up at David's house. He didn't look angry. He looked like a natural disaster waiting to happen. Coraline gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It was him. Back inside the house, David and Linda were eating meatloaf when the room suddenly lit up with the headlights from outside. "Who on earth is that?" Linda snapped, dropping her fork. "Is she back? Did she call the police?" David stood up, wiping his mouth. "If she brought the cops, I'll tell them she trespassed. I own this house." He marched to the front door and ripped it open, ready to scream at Coraline again. Instead, the words died in his throat. He stared at the wall of black steel parked in front of his house. He stared at the 2 security guards who looked like they could snap his neck with a glance. and he stared at the older man in the trench coat, who was currently lighting a cigar, shielding the flame from the rain with a gold lighter. The older man took a slow drag, exhaled a plume of blue smoke into the winter air, and locked eyes with David. "You must be David," the man said. His voice was smooth, deep, and terrifyingly calm. "I believe you have something of mine." David stammered, his bravado evaporating instantly. Who are you? You can't park here. This is private property." Linda appeared behind David, squinting. "Who is this David? Tell them to leave." The man in the trench coat smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "My name," he said, taking a step onto the walkway, "is Arthur Sterling. I'm Coraline's father, and I'm going to give you exactly 10 seconds to tell me where my daughter is before I have my associates dismantle this house brick by brick." David's jaw dropped. Linda went pale. Coraline's father. The deadbeat. The criminal. Arthur Sterling took another step. 1. She's not here," David squeaked. 2. She left." Arthur stopped. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. "She left, or you threw her out." He looked down at the muddy footprint on the welcome mat, a footprint that clearly belonged to a woman's shoe, sliding as if she were pushed. He looked at the suitcase abandoned in the puddle near the road. Arthur's face darkened. He turned to the massive guard with the umbrella. "Find her," Arthur commanded. "Tear this town apart until you find her, and keep the engine running. I need to have a word with my son-in-law." As the guards scattered, moving with military precision, David realized with a sinking feeling in his gut, the gasps from the neighbors weren't because of the cars. They were gasps of anticipation. He had just started a war he couldn't afford. David retreated into his hallway, the heels of his shoes clicking nervously against the laminate flooring. He felt small. The man standing in his doorway, Arthur Sterling, seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. Arthur stepped inside without an caution. He didn't wipe his feet. He tracked mud and rainwater onto the beige carpet Linda had insisted they buy last month. "You can't just barge in here," Linda shrieked, rallying her courage. She marched up to Arthur, pointing a manicured finger at his chest. "I don't care who you think you are. You're trespassing. Trespassing. I'm calling the police right now." Arthur didn't even blink. He looked down at Linda's finger, as if a fly had landed on his lapel. "Go ahead, madam," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble. "Call Chief Miller. Ask him how the Sterling Foundation's donation to the precinct's new tactical unit is coming along. I'm sure he'd love to explain to you why his officers won't be arresting me tonight." Linda's hand wavered. She lowered it slowly. David, trying to salvage some shred of masculinity, stepped forward. "Look, Mr. Sterling, if that's really who you are, Coraline lied to us. She lied about everything. She said she was poor. She said she had no family." "She didn't lie," Arthur said, walking past them into the living room. He looked around with open disdain, his eyes lingering on the mass-produced art from a discount store hanging above the fireplace. "She omitted. There is a difference." "Why?" David asked, his voice cracking. "If she comes from this," he gestured to the motorcade outside, "why live like this? Why let me pay for everything?" Arthur turned slowly. A cruel, amused smile played on his lips. "Let you pay for everything? Is that what you think happened?" He reached into his inside pocket. David flinched, expecting a weapon. Instead, Arthur pulled out a folded piece of paper, a bank statement. He tossed it onto the coffee table. Coraline walked away from the Sterling Empire because she wanted to find a man who loved her for her not my portfolio. She wanted a simple life. But she's my daughter. I never stopped watching, and I never stopped helping. David picked up the paper. His hands shook as he read the numbers. "The mystery account," Arthur said, his voice dripping with ice. "The one you and this harpy accused her of funneling money into. Look at the transaction history, David." David's eyes widened. "Deposits," he whispered. "These are all deposits." $5,000 a month, Arthur clarified. "Transferred from her trust to a joint account she set up in your name to pay off the mortgage on this house, to pay for the renovations, to pay for that car you drive." Linda snatched the paper from David's hands. "That's impossible. She was a barista. She made minimum wage. She worked as a barista because she wanted to feel normal." Arthur snapped, his patience fraying. "But my daughter realized you were struggling, David. You were drowning in student debt. You couldn't afford this house. So she subsidized your life secretly, so your fragile ego wouldn't shatter." The silence in the room was deafening. The only sound was the rain hammering against the roof. David felt like the floor had opened up beneath him. He thought back to every time the bills were miraculously paid, every time the grocery money stretched further than it should have. He had thought he was a financial genius. He had thought he was the provider. She was paying for everything," David stammered. "She was investing in her family," Arthur corrected. "An investment that has clearly gone bankrupt." Arthur walked over to the mantelpiece and picked up a framed photo of David and Coraline from their wedding day. He looked at Coraline's smiling face, then threw the frame into the fireplace. Glass shattered. "You called her a gold digger," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "You a man who is barely solvent threw an heiress worth $400 million out into the cold because you were too stupid to read a bank statement." "But the baby," Linda interjected, desperate to find a foothold. "She was cheating." "The baby isn't David's." Arthur laughed. It was a dry, humorless bark. "My security team has had eyes on Coraline since the day she met you. We have logs of everywhere she has been for 3 years. The grocery store, the doctor, the library, and home. She has never been with another man." He took a step toward Linda, towering over her. "That child is my grandson, and unfortunately for him, he shares DNA with a coward like your son. But don't worry, I'll make sure the Sterling genes are the dominant ones." David sank onto the sofa, his head in his hands. The magnitude of his mistake was crashing down on him. He hadn't just lost his wife. He hadn't just lost his child. He had destroyed his entire life based on his mother's paranoid whispers. "I have to find her," David mumbled, standing up. "I have to explain." "You will stay right there," Arthur commanded. The front door opened. One of the massive security guards walked in, rainwater dripping from his nose. He looked grim. "Mr. Sterling," the guard said, pressing a hand to his earpiece. "We checked the perimeter. She's not on the street, but Mrs. Higgins across the road. She says she saw Mrs. Coraline walking toward the bus stop at the junction. She said Mrs. Coraline looked unstable." Arthur's face went pale. The arrogance vanished, replaced by the raw fear of a father. "The bus stop is a half-mile away," Arthur said. "It's freezing." "Sir," the guard hesitated. "The drone heat signature just picked up a stationary object near the bench. Body temperature is dropping." Arthur didn't say another word to David. He spun on his heel, his trench coat flaring out behind him, and sprinted out the door into the rain. David watched him go, then looked at his mother. Linda was still clutching the bank statement, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. She really was rich, Linda whispered, a look of pure greed flashing in her eyes before the reality set in. David, we have to fix this. If she takes you back... Shut up, David said. It was the first time he had ever spoken to his mother that way. Just shut up. He ran to the door, but a remaining security guard blocked the exit with an arm like a steel bar. Mr. Sterling said to stay put, the guard said calmly. And if anything happens to his daughter, I strongly suggest you start praying. The rain had turned into a slushy sleet that coated the asphalt in a dangerous sheen. Arthur Sterling, a man who hadn't run in 20 years, was sprinting down the middle of the suburban street, his expensive Italian loafers splashing through puddles. The black SUVs roared to life, reversing and spinning around to follow him, their headlights cutting through the darkness. "Get the medical kit!" Arthur screamed into his lapel mic. "Get the trauma team on the line, now!" He reached the end of the cul-de-sac and turned onto the main avenue. The bus stop was ahead, a lonely metal structure under a flickering street lamp. At first he saw nothing. The bench looked empty. "No." Arthur gasped, his chest heaving. "Coraline." Then he saw it. A heap of wet fabric on the ground behind the bench, tucked into the corner where the wind was less severe. He reached her in seconds, sliding on his knees into the mud, ruining a $5,000 suit without a second thought. "Coraline, Coraline, baby, look at me." She was curled into a fetal position, clutching her stomach. Her skin was alabaster white, her lips a terrifying shade of blue. Her hair was plastered to her skull. She was shivering so violently that her teeth were clicking together with a sound that rattled Arthur's soul. She opened her eyes. They were unfocused, glassy. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Am I dreaming?" "No, sweetheart. I'm here. I've got you." Arthur choked out tears mixing with the rain on his face. He frantically pulled off his heavy wool trench coat and wrapped it around her, tucking it under her trembling body. "It hurts," she groaned, clutching her belly. "The baby. Something's wrong. It stopped moving." Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked up as the SUVs screeched to a halt. The back doors flew open, and 2 men jumped out. Not guards this time, but a private medical team Arthur traveled with everywhere. "Stretcher." "Now she's hypothermic and in distress," Arthur bellowed. "David," Coraline mumbled, her eyes rolling back. He threw the onesie in the mud." "Forget him," Arthur soothed, brushing the wet hair from her forehead. "He doesn't exist anymore. You're safe, I promise." The medics swarmed them. They placed a neck brace on her, checked her vitals, and lifted her onto the gurney with practiced efficiency. "BP is plummeting, sir," one of the medics shouted over the wind. "She's going into shock. We need to get her to St. Jude's immediately. The onboard crying unit isn't enough for a high-risk delivery." "Go," Arthur shouted, climbing into the back of the ambulance SUV hybrid next to his daughter. "Drive like hell." As the convoy peeled away, tires screeching, a lone figure stood at the end of the block. David had managed to slip out the back door while the guard was distracted by the radio chatter. He had run through the neighbors' yards, hopping fences, desperate to see what was happening. He stood in the shadows of a weeping willow tree, soaking wet, watching the red taillights of the motorcade fade into the distance. He saw the frantic movements. He saw the fear. He looked down at his phone. He had dialed 911, but his thumb hovered over the call button. What could he say? My billionaire father-in-law just kidnapped my wife, who I kicked out. A text message popped up on his screen. It was from the bank. Alert. Joint account ending in 4590 has been frozen. Balance $0. Please contact your branch. David stared at the screen. The money was gone. Coraline was gone. He turned to walk back to his house, but stopped. Mrs. Higgins was standing on the sidewalk, holding her little terrier. She was staring at David. The look on her face wasn't the usual nosy curiosity. It was pure disgust. You should be ashamed of yourself, David. The old woman spat her voice surprisingly strong. I saw what you did. I saw you push her, and I told the nice man in the suit everything. Mrs. Higgins, you don't understand. I understand perfectly, she interrupted. I understand that you're a small man who just made a very big enemy. If I were you, I'd lock my doors. David walked back to his house, the cold finally seeping into his bones. When he entered the foyer, Linda was there pacing. Well? She asked, her eyes darting around. Did she come back? Did you smooth it over? David looked at his mother, really looked at her for the first time in years. He saw the bitterness etched into the lines of her face. He saw the selfishness that had poisoned his marriage. She's gone, Mom, David said, his voice hollow. She's gone. The money is gone, and Arthur Sterling knows where we live. We can sue, Linda cried, grabbing his arm. Grandparents' rights, we can take them to court. David pulled his arm away. With what money you heard him. The account is frozen. We can't even afford a lawyer. Linda's face crumpled. But the nursery. The renovations. The bills are due next week. David walked past her up the stairs, past the empty spot where Coraline's suitcase had tumbled down. He went into the nursery. It was half finished. A crib stood in the corner, unassembled. He sat on the floor, surrounded by the wreckage of his life. Meanwhile, inside the speeding SUV, the situation was critical. Her fetal heart rate is decelerating, the medic said, his voice tight. We're 5 minutes out from the hospital. Arthur held Coraline's hand. It was limp. Stay with me, Coraline, he commanded, his voice breaking. You are a Sterling. We do not quit. Do you hear me? We do not quit. Coraline's eyes fluttered open for a second. She looked at her father, her gaze clearing for a brief moment of lucidity. If I don't make it, she whispered, squeezing his hand with surprising strength. Don't let him have the baby. Promise me. You are going to make it, Arthur insisted. Promise me, she wheezed. I promise, Arthur vowed. He will never touch this child. I swear it on my life. The SUV hit a pothole, jarring them. The monitor hooked up to Coraline let out a long, high-pitched whine. She's crashing, the medic yelled. Driver, move! Arthur watched the line on the monitor go flat. The world seemed to stop. The noise of the sirens, the rain, the engine, it all faded into a white buzz. His daughter, the only good thing he had ever produced in his miserable, wealthy life, was dying in front of him. And back in Oak Creek, David sat in the dark, listening to the silence of an empty house, unaware that the clock had just run out on his chance for redemption. The waiting room of St. Jude's Hospital was a sterilized purgatory. The fluorescent lights hummed with a headache-inducing frequency that seemed to drill directly into Arthur Sterling's skull. He had bought this wing of the hospital 5 years ago. His name was on the plaque by the elevator, but right now his money felt useless. It couldn't bribe the heart monitor to keep beeping. It couldn't pay the Grim Reaper to look the other way. Arthur stood by the window staring out at the city skyline, his reflection ghostly against the dark glass. His hands were still stained with the mud from the bus stop. "Mr. Sterling." Arthur turned sharply. A doctor in surgical scrubs stood there, looking exhausted. He pulled his mask down. "Tell me," Arthur said, his voice steel. "The baby is stable," the doctor said, exhaling a long breath. It was close. The umbilical cord was compressed, and his heart rate dropped significantly. "We had to perform an emergency C-section. He's in the NICU on oxygen, but he's a fighter. He's going to make it." Arthur felt his knees buckle. He grabbed the back of a plastic chair to steady himself. "And Coraline?" The doctor's expression didn't lighten. "Coraline is critical. She suffered severe hypothermia and eclampsia. Her blood pressure spiked, causing a seizure on the table. We've induced a coma to let her brain rest. The next 24 hours are decisive." Arthur nodded slowly. "I want security on her door. 2 men. Round the clock. No visitors. Especially not anyone with the last name Miller." "Understood." Arthur walked down the hallway to the NICU. He pressed his hand against the glass of the incubator. Inside, a tiny, fragile creature lay amidst a tangle of wires and tubes. His grandson. "Leo," Arthur whispered, naming him on the spot. "You're going to be a king, little one, and no one will ever hurt you again." He pulled out his phone. It was 3 a.m. He dialed a number that very few people possessed. "It's Blackwood," a crisp voice answered on the first ring. "Wake up the partners, James," Arthur said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I want you to look into David Miller. I want you to look into his mortgage, his employment, his credit cards, his car payments, his mother's gambling debts. Everything." "What's the objective, Arthur?" "Scorched earth," Arthur said. "I don't just want him ruined, I want him erased. By noon tomorrow, I want him to wish he had never been born." The sun rose over Oak Creek, unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded. David Miller woke up on the sofa, his neck stiff. The house was freezing. The heating had turned off during the night. He checked his phone. No messages from Coraline. No messages from the hospital. Just 3 missed calls from his boss. "Great," he muttered, rubbing his face. "Probably wants to know why I'm late." He showered quickly, ignoring the cold water, and put on his best suit. He had to keep it together. He was up for partner. Once he got the promotion, the money would come back. He could fix the bank account. He could hire a lawyer to deal with Arthur Sterling. "It's just a misunderstanding," he told himself as he drove to the architectural firm downtown. Rich people are reasonable when you explain things logically. He pulled into the parking garage, his stomach knotting when the barrier didn't lift. He swiped his pass again. Access denied. "Must be a glitch," he grumbled, pressing the intercom. "Hey, Jerry, it's David. Gate's stuck." "Sorry, Mr. Miller." The security guard's voice crackled back, sounding strangely formal. "I've been instructed not to let you in. Please park on the street." David frowned, backing up his car and finding a meter spots away. He marched into the lobby, ready to complain to HR. As he reached the glass doors, he saw his boss, Mr. Henderson, standing there. Beside him were 2 men in dark suits, holding a cardboard box. "David," Mr. Henderson said, not extending a hand. He looked pale, sweating slightly. "What's going on, Bob? My badge isn't working." We've had a restructuring," Henderson stammered, looking at the men in suits. "As of 8 o'clock a.m. this morning, This firm has been acquired by Sterling Global Development. David felt the blood drain from his face. What? New ownership, one of the suits said, stepping forward and shoving the cardboard box into David's chest. And the new policy is strictly zero tolerance regarding employees with pending fraud investigations. Fraud, David shouted. I haven't committed fraud. The audit regarding your expense accounts and the misuse of company resources started an hour ago, the suit said smoothly. We found discrepancies. You're terminated, effective immediately. If you return to the premises, you will be arrested for trespassing. You can't do this, I'm a partner. You were a junior associate, the suit corrected. Now you're unemployed. David stood on the sidewalk, clutching the box containing a stapler and a coffee mug as the glass doors slid shut. Passers-by stared. His phone buzzed. An email notification. From Oak Creek National Bank. Subject notice of foreclosure. Dear Mr. Miller, per the terms of your mortgage agreement, the freezing of your primary assets and the subsequent default on your insurance payments has triggered an immediate recall of the loan principal. It was happening fast. Too fast. He dialed Linda. Mum? Mum, answer the phone. David. Her voice was shrill. David. There are men here. They're taking the car. What men? The repo guys. No. They said the car was purchased with stolen funds from the Coraline Sterling Trust. They're towing it. And, David, they put a padlock on the shed. I'm coming home, David yelled, sprinting to his car. But when he got to his parking spot, his car was gone. In its place was a bright yellow boot on the ground and a citation for unpaid parking tickets dating back 3 years. Tickets he swore he had paid. David stood in the middle of the city, the wind whipping his tie around his face. He had no job. He had no car. He was losing his house. And somewhere in a high-rise tower overlooking the city, Arthur Sterling was watching a live feed of the street corner, sipping a black coffee. Phase 1 complete, Arthur whispered. It took David 3 hours to get home via public transport. He had to walk the last mile because he didn't have enough cash for the transfer. When he finally turned onto his street, the scene was humiliating. A tow truck was just pulling away with Linda's Honda Civic, the one Coraline had paid off for her birthday last year. A for sale sign was already being hammered into his lawn by a crew of workmen. Hey, David screamed, running up the driveway. You can't sell my house. I have 30 days. That's the law. The foreman turned around. He looked bored. Not when the property was used as collateral for a defaulted business loan. You co-signed this morning, buddy. I didn't co-sign anything this morning. Read the fine print of your employment contract. The foreman shrugged. Clause 44B, cross-collateralization in the event of termination for cause. Sterling Development owns the deed now. You have until sunset to vacate. David stormed into the house. It was chaos. Linda was running around like a headless chicken throwing silverware into a duffel bag. Mom, stop. David grabbed her shoulders. We have to fight this. We need a lawyer. Linda spun around, her eyes wild. She slapped his hand away. Fight it. With what? David. You idiot. You promised me you had handled her. You said she was nobody. You told me to kick her out. David roared back. You said she was cheating. You said the baby wasn't mine. I was protecting my interests, Linda screeched. And look what you did. You angered a billionaire. I looked him up, David. Arthur Sterling eats people like us for breakfast. He owns the police. He owns the bank. She zipped up the bag. I'm leaving. David froze. What? My sister in Dayton. She said I can stay on her couch if I bring groceries. I'm taking the silverware. You're leaving me? David asked, his voice breaking. Mom, I have nowhere to go. I have no money. Linda looked at her son. For a moment, David expected a hug. He expected the mother who had coddled him, who had told him he was special his whole life, to comfort him. Instead, Linda sneered. It was the same sneer she had given Coraline. You're a grown man, David. Figure it out. And don't call me until you have money again. I can't deal with your drama. She lugged the heavy bag toward the door. Oh, and David. You were right. About what? Coraline. She was the best thing that ever happened to you, and you blew it because you were too weak to tell your mother to shut up. The door slammed. David was alone. He walked into the living room. The TV was gone. Linda must have sold it or hidden it. The house echoed. He sat on the floor where Coraline used to do her prenatal yoga. He remembered how she would laugh when she lost her balance. He remembered how she used to make him coffee in the morning, even when she was sick. He remembered the look in her eyes last night. The terror. I killed her, he thought. Even if she's alive, I killed us. The doorbell rang. David didn't want to answer, but he thought maybe, just maybe, it was Coraline. Maybe she had come back to forgive him. He opened the door. It wasn't Coraline. It was a process server, a short, balding man with a clipboard. David Miller. Yes, David whispered. You've been served. He handed David a thick stack of papers. David looked at the cover sheet. Superior Court of Ohio. Plaintiff Coraline Sterling. Defendant David Miller. Petition for absolute divorce. Sole custody and restraining order. He flipped the page. There was a DNA test attached. Probability of paternity 99.999%. Father David Miller. He flipped another page. Pictures. Pictures of Linda at the casino. Pictures of David at a bar with his friends when he said he was working late. Pictures of Coraline, alone, pregnant, waiting for a bus. And a letter from Arthur Sterling. Handwritten. David, Coraline woke up an hour ago. She asked about the baby. She asked about me. She did not ask about you. Sign the papers. If you contest this, I will release the audit of your firm's accounts to the FBI. You won't just be homeless. You'll be in federal prison. You have 1 hour. A.S. David slid down the doorframe until he hit the floor. He wept. Not the angry tears of the night before, but the ugly, snot-nosed sobbing of a man who realizes he has absolutely nothing left to lose because he threw it all away. He took a pen from his pocket, the cheap Bic pen, not his expensive fountain pen, which was in the box on the lawn, and signed the papers. 18 months later. The relentless November rain of Columbus, Ohio, hadn't changed, but everything else had. The Grand Hotel stood like a beacon of gold in the center of the city, its massive crystal chandeliers casting a warm, inviting glow that spilled out onto the wet pavement. Valets in red vests sprinted back and forth, opening the doors of Bentleys, Rolls-Royces, and limousines, shielding the city's elite under oversized umbrellas as they hurried into the gala for new beginnings. Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and fresh lilies. A string quartet played a soft, melancholic rendition of Vivaldi. Waiters circulated with flutes of champagne that cost more than a mortgage payment. At the center of it all, standing on a raised podium, was Coraline Sterling. She was unrecognizable from the woman who had been dragged out of a suburban house in sweatpants a year and a half ago. Tonight, she wore a floor-length emerald gown made of silk that shimmered like water under the lights. Her hair, once limp and wet with rain, was styled in elegant waves. But the biggest change wasn't the clothes or the hair, it was her eyes. They no longer held the frantic, desperate look of a woman trying to please a husband who didn't want her. They held the steel of a woman who had walked through fire and survived. In her arms, resting on her hip with the ease of a practiced mother, was a toddler. He was 18 months old, with a mop of curly dark hair and bright, inquisitive eyes that scanned the crowd. Leo. Coraline leaned into the microphone. The room, filled with politicians, CEOs, and philanthropists, fell instantly silent. "Thank you," Coraline said, her voice clear and resonant, devoid of the tremor that used to plague her when David yelled. "When I founded the Sterling Sanctuary 6 months ago, I did it for a simple reason. I learned the hard way that financial abuse is just as violent as physical abuse. I learned that having a roof over your head shouldn't cost you your dignity." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "I stood in the rain once," Coraline continued, tightening her grip on Leo, who cooed softly. "I had nothing. I was convinced I was worthless because the person I loved told me I was. But tonight, looking at my son, I know the truth. We are not defined by who discards us. We are defined by how we rebuild." Thunderous applause erupted. Arthur Sterling, seated at the front table, didn't clap. He just watched his daughter with a fierce, quiet pride, wiping a single tear from his weathered cheek. He had almost lost her. Now she was the queen of the city. Outside, separated by a pane of glass that might as well have been 1,000 miles thick, a man stood shivering in the shadows of a bus shelter. David Miller pulled the collar of his thin grey utility jacket up around his ears. It didn't help. The damp cold of the warehouse floor where he spent 12 hours a day seemed to have permanently settled into his bones. He wasn't supposed to be here. He had missed his transfer bus to the studio apartment he rented on the south side, a basement unit with mold in the bathroom and paper-thin walls. While waiting for the next bus, the lights of the hotel had caught his eye. He stepped closer, drawn like a moth to a flame. He saw the banner hanging over the entrance, the Sterling Sanctuary charity gala. He knew who she was. Everyone knew. Coraline Sterling was on the cover of local magazines. She was the philanthropist of the year. David pressed closer to the window, ignoring the water soaking into his canvas sneakers. His reflection in the glass was a ghost of his former self. His hair was thinning and unkempt. His face was gaunt lines of stress and exhaustion, etched deep around his mouth. He looked 10 years older than the man who had thought he was too good for his barista wife. Through the glass, he saw her. His breath hitched in his throat. She was beautiful. Not just pretty, she was radiant. She looked powerful. Then he saw the boy. David's hand, involuntarily lifted fingers, splayed against the cold glass. The boy was laughing at something a waiter had done. He threw his head back, a wide, toothy grin spreading across his face. It was David's smile. It was the only thing David had left to give, and he had given it to a stranger. "He looks like me," David whispered, his voice cracking. The sound was swallowed by the traffic noise. "He looks exactly like me." A sharp pain twisted in his gut, a mix of regret, shame, and a profound, hollow loneliness. He remembered the nursery he had half built. He remembered the name he had picked out, a name Coraline hadn't used. He remembered the onesie in the mud. Suddenly, the doors of the hotel swung open. David panicked. He tried to turn to run, but his legs felt like lead. It wasn't Coraline. It was a valet bringing a sleek black car around to the front. The back door opened, and a man stepped out to smoke a cigar. Arthur Sterling. Arthur took a long drag, exhaling the smoke into the night air. He looked exactly the same as the night he had arrived with the motorcade, imposing, dangerous, immovable. Arthur turned his head. His eyes locked onto the figure in the shadows across the street. David froze. He felt like a deer in the headlights. He wanted to scream, to beg, to ask for 5 minutes to explain. I didn't know he wanted to shout. My mother made me do it. But as Arthur stared at him, David realized the truth. It didn't matter. Arthur didn't look angry anymore. He didn't look vengeful. He looked at David with the same indifference one would look at a discarded wrapper on the sidewalk. Arthur reached into his tuxedo pocket, pulled out his phone, and typed a quick message. Then he turned his back on David and walked back into the warmth of the gala. David's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out with trembling hands. It was an automated notification from his new low-limit bank account. Transfer received $1 reference child support. Final settlement. It was a final insult. A reminder that they didn't need his money. They didn't need his help. To them, he was worth less than the transaction fee. Inside the ballroom, the music swelled. Coraline was laughing, holding Leo up to touch the crystals of the chandelier. She was surrounded by light. David looked at his phone, then at the hotel, and finally at his own reflection. I had it all, he whispered to the rain. I had the lottery ticket in my hand, and I threw it away. The bus arrived with a screech of brakes, spewing exhaust into his face. David didn't look back at the hotel. He stepped onto the bus, swiped his pass, and moved to the back, disappearing into the grey, anonymous crowd of the city, leaving the warmth and the light to the family he had kicked out into the cold. And that is the tragic reality of David Miller. He traded a diamond for a stone because he let his insecurity and his mother's poison dictate his life. He learned too late that a woman's value isn't in her bank account, but in her loyalty, and that when you break a trust that deep, no amount of apology can fix it. Coraline and Leo found their happiness not because of the money, but because they broke free. What do you think? Did David deserve to lose absolutely everything? Or was Arthur's revenge too cruel? And what would you have done if you were in Coraline's shoes? Would you have ever told him the truth about the money? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching, and remember, be careful who you discard. They might be the only one holding you up. See you in the next video.